On an early Wednesday morning in 1992, a husband and father called home to check in on his family. His wife was typically on her own in the morning, managing the routine of caring for their preschooler while getting their elementary-aged son up and moving and out the door, while he was at work. Appreciating that she had her hands full, he liked to call to make sure the older boy was getting out of bed and on the bus okay. His first call went unanswered, which he found odd, but he dismissed his worry. But the feeling just nagged at him, so a little while later, he called back. This time, someone did answer, but the voice on the other end wasn't his wife. It was the voice of a 3-year-old who simply said, "Mommy's bleeding." Those 2 words would jumpstart an investigation into one of the most gruesome and senseless murders the area has ever seen. Despite the circumstances, the case is hugely underreported on. Luckily, it's one that has a strong chance at being solved. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Elena Sanchez Hawkins. Elena Sanchez Hawkins and her husband Michael had been married for nearly a decade as they entered the year of 1992. Both 29 years old, together they had 2 boys, one who was in elementary school and one who was just 3 years old. They were a loving, compatible, working-class couple who alternated schedules to be there for their kids as much as possible. Michael and Elena both worked at convenience store gas stations along West Dixie Avenue in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Now, Elizabethtown is a decent-sized town and a central location for amenities in this part of the state. Michael and Elena both worked in that town, and technically their address falls within it. But sometimes you'll hear in articles that they lived near Boston, Kentucky. I'll have a map of this on our Instagram at SimplerTime Crime Pod, but the couple lived at 700 Bardstown Road, Elizabethtown, Kentucky. The single-story home they lived in is no longer there, but I'll also have a Google Street View so you can get a sense of the area. If you're a true crime content listener, hearing Bardstown might have perked your ears up. If you know, you know, and if you don't, fear not, I'll talk about it more a bit later. It is in close proximity to Bardstown, but this is Bardstown Road, not the town. Bardstown Road is also known as US Highway 62, and if you take it out of Elizabethtown, you'll head northeast on it and go through Boston, which is a teeny tiny town that sits between Elizabethtown and Bardstown. Eventually, if you keep following Highway 62, you will get to Bardstown. Their home was right in between Elizabethtown and Boston, and this is important because Elizabethtown is central with businesses and houses, but they are just in that for the postal address. Their home was in a more isolated stretch. There are other houses, but it's on the outskirts of town, and the lots are big, tons of fields around them, and you might not have a neighbor for a bit. Elena was described as being friendly but introverted. She had really settled down and spent a lot of the time with her family. Her brother Danny would later say in an interview that she would always take up for you and was a great mother and kind person. The morning of January 8th, 1992 was ordinary. Her oldest son was set to get on the bus a little after 7 a.m. to head to Lincoln Trail Elementary School, which was just 3 miles up the road on Bardstown Road. I get the sense from the source material that, like many small kids, he wasn't always the most eager to get out of bed and get to school. And who can blame him? January, right after school break, in the dead of winter? No thanks. So sometimes Michael, who would already be at work at that time, would call to check in on the routine and make sure their son was moving. Nothing like a little motivation of a phone call from Dad to keep you on track. He did get on the bus that morning without issue, and Michael called around the time his son was set to get on the bus, but didn't get an answer at the house. This is one of those cases where different newspapers and other news outlets report different times. Even different articles that reference police reports talk about different times. And that's in terms of the exact bus pickup as well as the second phone call. So bear with me with that. So at first, Michael did think it was kind of weird that his wife didn't answer, but he didn't think too much of it. But it was enough that he decided to call back a little while later in the morning. And when he called back the second time, that's when his heart sank. At the other end of the call was his 3-year-old son, and he said the words, "Mommy's bleeding." Heart racing, Michael rushed home and stumbled into a scene out of a horror movie. There was his toddler son, and on the floor of the living room, his wife lay motionless in a pool of blood. Michael called 911. When police and paramedics arrived, they reported that Michael was just in a state of shock, almost like a trance. He couldn't process what was happening. Michael could only have 2 bits of the slightest relief, if you even want to call it that, but his older boy had made it to school safely, and his toddler, tiny witness to this horrible act, was physically unharmed. Paramedics evaluated Elena, but it was clear right away that there would be no saving her. 29-year-old Elena Sanchez Hawkins was dead, murdered in front of her 3-year-old child. Her death had been brutal. She had been sexually assaulted, and evidence related to that was collected. Elena's hands had been bound behind her back, she had been stabbed multiple times, and her throat was slit from ear to ear. It was determined that she had died within just a couple of minutes from excessive blood loss. Because of this, the room was very bloody as well. Detectives processed the crime scene. They looked all over for a murder weapon or any discarded evidence in her trash. Police have kept a lot of the crime scene evidence a secret, so I don't know if they have anything like shoe prints, for example, or fibers, or anything really to the extent of the evidence they collected. They have really just kept it under wraps. Though the neighbors were a fair distance apart, police canvassed the area and looked to talk to people. And of course, investigators also had a look close to home. Kentucky State Police Detective Rob Foster, who investigated the case back in 1992, said to the Messenger Inquirer in 2012, quote, "In a case like this, it's natural to look at the husband. We truly did eliminate him fairly soon in the investigation. I believe then and now that he had nothing to do with what happened," end quote. So we can kind of nix that right off the bat. When you think about it, it makes sense. The 3-year-old would have recognized his own father. Not to mention, he had an airtight alibi being at work at the time of the murder. Now, some people, and by people I mean people on the internet, have found Michael's phone call suspicious from the lens of, okay, we know he didn't physically commit the crime, but maybe he knew somebody was showing up to commit the crime and that he had arranged it and he was calling to prove and pinpoint his alibi, like, nope, I was really at the gas station, I couldn't have done this. Yada, 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 you can fill in the rest. To me, that's extremely far-fetched. Nobody does a murder for hire plot and asks the person to rape the person and leave their DNA and then stab them repeatedly. That's not how it works. Murder for hire plots are usually done by gunfire, very transactional, and nobody close to the family or police have ever entertained this theory, and I don't blame them. So ruling out her husband and knowing that Elena kept a tight circle, who could have done this and why? Investigators noted that there was no forced entry into the house, and so most reporting on the case shares their theory that this was someone she knew. Now, statistically, yes, most people are killed by somebody they know versus a stranger. Statistically speaking, in cases where women were the victims of murder or non-negligent manslaughter, 34% of them were murdered by an intimate partner, and 76% of murders were committed by someone the victim knew. That does still leave people who get murdered by strangers, though. And I hate that the lack of forced entry always convinces people that it was someone known to the victim. This is the countryside of Kentucky. Not everyone is locking their doors. And even think about your own habits. Do you ever leave the door unlocked just for a moment, just while you're unloading groceries, or just for a few minutes after you get your son on the bus? We don't know if Elena Sanchez Hawkins had the door locked at the time of the murder, and that's kind of the point. it doesn't tell us as much as we think. Let's say she did have the door locked. Someone could have used a ruse for her to open it. I think of the Darlene Hulse case that was covered by the Deck Investigates podcast, and her daughters actually witnessed her attack. It was a stranger who posed as a delivery person or the like. All it takes is for someone to crack the door open just a little bit and boom, she could have been overpowered. The police investigating the case were getting nowhere fast. And what's strange about this case is that despite this being a very violent crime in an area that hardly got any, the story of Elena's murder was a blip in the news cycle. In fact, here are the words from the exact news article published the day after her death. It says, "Woman found dead, Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Kentucky State Police were investigating the death of a 29-year-old Elizabethtown woman who was found dead at her home by her husband Wednesday morning. Elena Sanchez Hawkins was found at about 10 a.m. Eastern Time with what appeared to be a knife wound," said Trooper Eddie Lair of the Elizabethtown Post. So that's it. That's the whole article, not even a picture. Within days, police tried a strategy we've seen in other cases. They set up police cars in roadblocks around the stretch of road Elena lived on to look for cars that frequently traveled on that route, particularly at the same time of day. They were not only looking for the killer, they were also looking for witnesses, and one car they stopped had a new tip. An eyewitness reported that around 7:30 a.m. on the morning of the murder, they had seen a black Datsun pickup truck. Now, I didn't know what this was, so I looked it up, and I will have a picture of one on the Instagram. It's a Nissan pickup truck that isn't called a Datsun anymore, and it definitely has a unique look to it. They don't make this exact kind anymore. The truck was described as black with a short bed, a standard cab, and no chrome. In addition, the truck had tie-down hooks and was fitted with a metal topper. Police went searching for people who drove this vehicle and any leads that this eyewitness sighting could produce, but they came up empty, which was disappointing because, as you can imagine, this wasn't a super common vehicle and it had unique characteristics. That's something where nowadays the DMV databases, they existed back then, but they're so much more digitalized now and you can get so much more information than you could back then. It's way easier to just run a report and get information that has these features carved out. So given all of that, then and now, the black Datsun truck has been a piece of the puzzle that hasn't quite fit anywhere, but it's still kept in the back of investigators' minds. Now, you'll remember I shared that Elena worked at a gas station on West Dixie Avenue in the heart of Elizabethtown, and in interviewing her coworkers, they gathered that she was a laid-back person who didn't have problems with anyone. But like many gas station workers, she had her share of creepy or rude customers, and one in particular, she went as far as mentioning he gave her the creeps. She said he looked at her funny and made her uncomfortable. One question I have is, were other people working with her and know the man she was talking about? And we don't know the answer to that. And why that's important is, if she worked with others and she had said, this guy's creepy, it's this regular, he's weirding me out, someone could have done a composite sketch in the aftermath. If she just relayed information in passing to other colleagues, say at shift change, well then they may not know who it is. But police have never released more information about this, and if there ever was any type of composite sketch done of this customer, it's never been released to the public, which would sort of defeat the purpose. As far as Elena's youngest son, he was too young to provide much information. Notably, he didn't mention the name of anybody that he recognized. So while he didn't have a ton of information to provide, there's a part of his absence of information that also gives a clue. And to me, it goes back to losing the tunnel vision and considering that the person could have been a stranger. Hauntingly, he would refer to, quote, the man at times, and it was clear he had witnessed something horrific. While, of course, everyone was so glad the killer did not physically harm Elena's son, that was an interesting piece to consider because if it was somebody that he knew, he may have wanted to eliminate the witness. So either the child hid the whole time, which would be impressive for a 3-year-old, but I guess not unheard of, or the assailant was confident that the child did not know him and could not ID him. Elena's case quickly went cold. There were no suspects. Police seemed to think it was someone she knew because of the no forced entry, but there was no indication of anybody who would want to do this in her circle. Elena's husband, Michael, would keep in touch with law enforcement. If he would hear of a similar case in Kentucky or even states nearby, he would contact law enforcement and see if there was a possibility of a connection. He mourned his wife and the life he had expected to live out with her, but he tried to make the best life for himself and his boys moving forward. He moved out of the area to another town, coached youth football, and he got remarried. But tragically, in 2004, he died suddenly of natural causes at the age of just 42 years old. This left Elena and Michael's youngest child without both of his parents at just 15. That's devastating, and my heart just breaks for him, and it's part of why I wanted to cover this case. Even though it's difficult to find details, this little boy witnessed something horrific, and the person who did this to his mother deserves to be behind bars. The next lead in Elena's case wouldn't come until 2008, 16 years after her murder, when another crime happened nearby with eerie similarities. But this victim survived. I want to thank you for listening to this week's episode and your support of the podcast. I'm hoping to reach more people, so please recommend the podcast to your friends, coworkers, family, the cashier at the grocery store. Be that person. It really, really helps. I'm also on social media, mostly posting on TikTok and Instagram. If you love podcasts but wish you could have visuals to some of the details I tell in the episode, I post supporting pictures each week on Instagram. On TikTok, I do mini episodes on various topics, solved cases, and even more recent cases that all tie together with a connection to this podcast. So tune in, give me a follow, write a review, and tell others. Now, back to the show. In August of 2008, police were called to the scene of a home in the town of Hardinsburg in Breckinridge County. This is about a 1-hour drive west of Elena Sanchez Hawkins' home. And what they stumble into is shocking. You see, a woman had been home with her granddaughter, who was a young toddler, around 20 months old. And suddenly, she was attacked by a man who had gained entry into her home. Now, the details on if she let this person in, if they broke in, if the door was unlocked, this hasn't ever been released. What we know is that he viciously attacked her. He said, "You're gonna die today." She was raped, with some details relating to that being too graphic to even describe on this podcast. I'm not going to, just because it's not really necessary. But what piece was revealed to Wave 3 News in Kentucky was that her throat was slit first, and then she was raped and stabbed more. At a point, the woman tried to trick her assailant by playing dead. Despite knowing that she was dying and bleeding out, she held perfectly still. And it worked. Her attacker left, thinking he had killed her. Once she heard him leave, she crawled through the house to a phone where she hit a panic button and 911 was dispatched. When paramedics got there, she was in critical condition, but somehow she was still alive. And not only that, she mustered up the courage and energy to tell them who her attacker was. Her neighbor, a 59-year-old man named Ernest Pine. This woman was transported to the hospital for multiple emergency surgeries and placed in a medically induced coma, but she managed to survive her ordeal. She has lifelong scars and injuries still, both physically and undoubtedly emotionally. Ernest Pine was charged with rape, sodomy, burglary, and attempted murder, and this crime had police and locals making a connection. In both the Breckinridge County case and Elena's, both victims had been raped, both had a small child home with them, and both had their throats cut and left for dead. Shortly after Pine's arrest, Wave 3 News asked Detective Matt Johnson of the Kentucky State Police if they were going to look into Ernest Pine as a suspect in Elena's murder, and he said, quote, "That's way in the future. Right now, we are handling this case right here in front of us, and we are going to see it through to the end before we focus on other stuff," end quote. That future he talked about came quick, and it didn't look like much was being done to investigate Pine and Elena's murder. Initially, Pine had pled not guilty, but a plea deal was reached, and by June of 2009, less than a year after the attack, Ernest Pine reached a plea deal which lessened the severity of the charges but avoided a trial. He was sentenced to just 20 years in prison. In the 2012 Messenger Inquirer piece on Elena's case, Detective Jason Probst, who was assigned to Elena's case, was asked about the potential of Pine being a person of interest. He said he couldn't outright name him as a suspect, but does refer to him as someone of interest. Still, he said, as of 2012, they had not even interviewed Pine. And my question is, why? One piece that may seem like a stretch between the two cases is that there was an hour's worth of driving distance apart between the two crime scenes. But guess where Ernest Pine lived in 1992? You guessed it, Elizabethtown. I looked up his former address, and he lived on Helm Avenue, which is in the heart of Elizabethtown, right in the action. His house to Elena's was almost 7 miles away, so not exactly her neighbor like he was with the other victim. However, his house to the gas stations on West Dixie, 0.2 miles or a 4-minute walk. He was right there. After the connection, possibly to Ernest Pine, police have made little progress on the case since then. There haven't been any other leads, and this case is icy cold. So what I want to do next is focus on two other aspects we haven't talked about that didn't fit in a way where I could just pop them into the case timeline. The first thing I want to talk about is DNA evidence. We talked about how she had been sexually assaulted, and that evidence was collected. In 1992, DNA was still in its infancy and way different than where it is now. Testing throughout the 90s and early 2000s required a lot more of a sample. What investigators revealed in 2012 was that at that point, they had used up most of the DNA and they had just a tiny, tiny bit left. At that point, they were hesitant to use any more and be left without the one thing that could solve the case. Detective Probst said in a 2012 interview, quote, "There is new testing on the horizon to test without consuming evidence. It may be better to wait for the testing methods to advance. You can try and balance everything. If all the evidence becomes consumed and 2 years later new testing is available, then you have nothing to test. If you wait, the case may remain cold." End quote. I can certainly understand being in a tough spot with that one. Police have not released what they've looked into with her evidence in the years since then, if anything. We don't know what size sample and exactly what they have left, but DNA has come a long way in the last 13 years. So that's where things left off with DNA. The other piece I'd like to talk about is the Bardstown factor, I'll call it, which I brought up in the beginning. Bardstown, Kentucky is a bit of a true crime anomaly. I actually visited it in the fall of 2024, and if you're in it, it feels like a regular, safe, small town with friendly people. If you go to the Old Talbot Tavern, you can have a drink at the oldest bourbon bar in the world. But for being a small town in the middle of Kentucky with just under 14,000 residents, it's had some weird, violent crime occur. There are several podcasts devoted to just the Bardstown mysteries. Notably, these are the top 4 cases you'll hear about. The first is Crystal Rogers, who disappeared on 4th of July weekend in 2015. Her live-in boyfriend, Brooks Hauk, was the last person to see her. He stated he went to bed around 11 the night before, that she was still awake and playing on her phone, and when he woke up, she was gone. Her car was found abandoned on mile marker 14 of the Bluegrass Parkway. She's never been found. Her case is very complicated. Brooks was the prime suspect almost from the get-go, and his brother worked with the Bardstown Police Department at the time, and things got weird there too. He refused to investigate, And then Brooks ended up getting charged with the crime along with a host of other people who were involved in some way or another. And I'm way oversimplifying it only because it's a rabbit hole of a case that we don't even have time to scratch the surface of. But case number 2 of 4 that people talk about is the suspicious death of Tommy Ballard, and that's Crystal Rogers' stepfather. He was relentless in his pursuit of her killer, or thinking she was killed because obviously she hadn't been found at that time. She's presumed dead. And so he was constantly bringing attention to her case and digging things up. And he was hunting one morning in 2016, and somebody shot him in the chest. Initially, it was considered just a tragic hunting accident, but with time, it seems like that is not the case, and it's never been determined who pulled the trigger. Case number 3, we're kind of working backwards, but that's the 2013 murder of 33-year-old Bardstown police officer Jason Ellis. At about 2:30 a.m. on May 25th, 2013, he left the Bluegrass Highway on exit 34. He found the ramp blocked with tree limbs. He turned his overhead lights on, turned the patrol car to block the ramp, and began clearing the limbs. With several limbs cradled in his arms, shotgun blasts rang out from the embankment. Pellets tore into Officer Ellis's arm, side, neck, head, and other areas not protected by his ballistic vest. He fell to the ground among the limbs he was carrying. Jason Ellis died of his wounds, and it was definitely thought to be an ambush attack. Nobody has ever been arrested for his murder. Case number 4 is the mother-daughter murder of 48-year-old Kathy Netherland and her 16-year-old daughter Samantha. Kathy was a special education teacher, and Samantha was in 10th grade. In 2014, they were found brutally murdered in their home. Both Kathy and Samantha had been beaten, and their throats were slit as well. Autopsies confirmed that Kathy died from several gunshot wounds, while Samantha had been bludgeoned and stabbed to death. So yeah, that's a lot of crime, and Bardstown is only about a 20-minute drive from Elena's house. So naturally, sometimes the commentary around Elena's case speculates as to whether she is connected to the other Bardstown crime. The Bardstown crime is one of those topics people have really, really strong opinions on. Some people think all the cases are connected, and they will point a whole web of how. I actually encourage you to listen to podcasts on it. It's pretty fascinating. Others think some are connected, while others have a completely different view of suspects and who could be involved. So, could Elena's case have a connection to one of those? Maybe. Given the throats being slit, my amateur opinion would be that if there was a connection to any, it would be the murders of Kathy and Samantha. But there's actually a different unsolved Bardstown case that isn't mentioned that often, and it could very well be connected too. That's the 1990 murder of 39-year-old Lucinda Strange. Lucinda, like Elena, was a quiet family woman and mother who kept to herself. She worked at a local hotel, and her husband Jerome had a dream home on 10 acres on Clarktown Road in Bardstown. She had a routine where after she got home from work, she'd go for a walk around the remote stretch of road for some exercise. On March 25th, 1990, she did her routine, only she didn't return home, and as it got dark, Jerome started to worry. Not far from their home, Lucinda was found lying on the side of the road. Initially, people thought that she had just been hit by a car, but closer investigation found that she had been stabbed 40 times and was within 200 feet of her property. Jerome was home with their daughter at the time, and he had a solid alibi. You can see, even in recent interviews with him, the emotion is still raw. He was interviewed around the 30-year anniversary in 2020, and he's just so desperate to have his wife's case solved. But it's still cold without any suspects or any leads. Another tragic death caught up in the darkness of Bardstown, unsolved. Like Elena's, Lucinda was stabbed, though no evidence of sexual assault was found. At least it wasn't released to the media. It seems like a random blitz attack, and I'm going to share photos of the street view on the Instagram. It's definitely a narrow back road in the country, so you have to wonder if someone just took advantage of the opportunity or if somebody had been watching her, as this was a regular routine of hers. The case of Elena Sanchez Hawkins sits alongside countless other unsolved crimes in the state of Kentucky. But Elena's does have a chance of being solved. We know there's DNA evidence. So some of my questions are, number one, what remains of the DNA to be tested? What is the Kentucky State Police's plan to investigate her case moving forward? What is the most recent thing that's even been done? And number two, what is being done to investigate Ernest Pine? Has he even ever been interviewed at this point? Did he drive a black Datsun truck? If he didn't, it wouldn't rule him out, but if he did, that would be a very important clue. Is there any other evidence that could be tested and linked back to Pine? Did anybody who worked with her ever see Ernest Pine come into the station? If you worked with Elena Sanchez Hawkins back in the early 90s, please DM me, please get in touch. I'd love to talk and ask some clarifying questions. And if I get enough information, I'll even do a bonus mini episode. Ernest Pine is innocent in this case until proven otherwise, but the clock is ticking. This episode is being released in March of 2025, and as of this time, Ernest Pine is eligible for parole on August 18th, 2025. I'll post his Department of Corrections picture. He's in his 70s now, but he does not look weak or frail or unable to come right back out and do the exact same thing. His maximum sentence expires in 2028, just 3 years from now. If ever there was a time to dig into Elena's case, the best time would have been earlier, but the second best time is now. I stated earlier that Elena's case has been absurdly underreported on. I believe investigators do want to see it solved, and I think it does haunt the original investigators, but not enough has been done since. In recent years, Elena's younger brother has been pushing for answers. He has done some of his own sleuthing and says he has encountered information he thinks could help police, but according to an article from the last few years, he has seldom even gotten calls back. So please, please share her case, share this episode, put pressure on to re-examine the evidence and push this case towards resolution. If you have any information on the murder of Elena Sanchez Hawkins, please contact the Kentucky State Police at 270-766-5078. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe, share, and leave a 5-star review. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back next Monday.